Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, listener name, you ready to jump into this? We're diving into the deep end today with the early Cold War.
Ooh, yeah. The Cold War's such a fascinating period.
It really is, and specifically we're looking at the U.S. policy of containment in Europe.
Right, containment.
We've got some great excerpts lined up from the Mr. Hutchings History podcast, episode 32, Containment in Europe, the Truman Doctrine, and the Berlin Airlift. Should be a wild ride.
I'm ready when you are.
So, thinking about this period, right, it's easy to get bogged down in the politics and the jargon.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
But at its core, it's really a story about human choices, right? The decisions that countries and leaders made and the very real impact those choices had on people's lives.
Absolutely. I mean, we're talking about a world rebuilding after World War II.
Recovering from this massive global conflict.
Exactly. Desperate for stability, but also thrust into this whole new kind of conflict.
And that's the thing about this period is like trying to assemble this giant puzzle, but like half the pieces are missing.
And the other half keep changing.
Yes. You've got this backdrop of a devastated Europe, right? Politically and economically fragile.
Completely vulnerable.
And into that vacuum steps the United States, but in a way they never really had before.
Well, they saw an opportunity, right? Britain, exhausted after the war with this massive debt, they couldn't maintain their traditional role in places like Greece and Turkey.
And those were some key strategic locations.
Absolutely. And the U.S. recognized that if they didn't step in, well, those countries were ripe for Soviet influence.
Which brings us to the Truman Doctrine. 1947, Truman delivers this speech to Congress.
What a famous speech.
Oh, absolutely. And it sends shockwaves around the world. I mean, he basically draws a line in the sand.
He did. He really did.
He says, and I'm quoting here, "The United States must support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures." Bold words.
He wasn't mincing words, that's for sure.
Not at all. This wasn't just about Greece and Turkey anymore, was it? This was a declaration, a commitment to containing communism wherever it might appear.
The start of a new era, a new foreign policy.
And you can just imagine the tension, right? The realization that the world had fundamentally changed.
Oh, absolutely. The stakes were higher than ever.
But, containing communism wasn't just about military might, was it? It was also about, well, economics.
Enter the Marshall Plan.
Right. This massive economic recovery plan for Europe.
Yeah.
Billions of dollars poured into rebuilding.
The idea being that economic stability would be like this bulwark against communism.
Right, because if people are doing okay, they're less likely to be swayed by, well, radical ideology.
Exactly. A happy stomach makes for a happy heart.
Right.
But on a continental scale.
I like that. But I imagine not everyone was thrilled about the Marshall Plan. I mean, was it really just pure generosity? Or was there, a bit more to it?
The million-dollar question, right? Was it genuine aid or a way for the U.S. to exert its influence?
I mean, it did give them a lot of soft power.
It did indeed. And Stalin certainly saw it that way.
Oh, yeah, he called it, what, dollar imperialism?
Dollar imperialism. Precisely. He believed, and not without reason, that it was a blatant attempt by the U.S. to undermine Soviet influence in Europe.
He forbade any Soviet-aligned nation from accepting aid, right?
He did, which only heightened the tensions that were already simmering.
Talk about adding fuel to the fire. And speaking of fire, this takes us to a pivotal event that really threw gasoline on those flames. The Czech coup of 1948. I mean, can you imagine waking up one morning and seeing democratic Czechoslovakia falls to communism, plastered across the headlines?
Oh, yeah. It sent shockwaves through the West.
It's like the sudden realization that, whoa, this isn't just some far-off conflict anymore.
It really hit home for a lot of people.
This was right in the heart of Europe.
Absolutely. A real wake-up call.
And it really validated those fears of a communist domino effect, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. People started to worry that if Czechoslovakia could fall, who would be next?
Right, like nowhere was safe.
Exactly.
So what did the U.S. do? Send in the troops.
Well, not quite. Military intervention wasn't really on the table, at least not directly.
Right.
Right.
But the Czech coup, it had this profound psychological impact.
Oh, for sure. It's like, okay, things just got real.
Exactly. And historian Walter Lefebvre, he argues that the Czech coup was actually the decisive factor in getting the Marshall Plan through U.S. Congress.
Really?
Yeah, before the coup, there was a lot of hesitation about the Marshall Plan.
Which makes sense. It was a huge financial commitment.
Oh, absolutely. Billions and billions of dollars. Some people thought it was too much, too risky.
But then Czechoslovakia happens, and suddenly
the need to contain communism, to prevent it from spreading any further, It became paramount.
Desperate times, desperate measures.
Precisely.
But even with the Marshall Plan in place, Stalin still saw it as a threat, right?
Oh, absolutely. He was convinced it was all part of this American scheme to undermine Soviet influence.
So how did he respond?
With a move that was both daring and, well, more than a little reckless.
Okay, you've got to give us the details.
Picture this. Berlin, deep within Soviet-controlled East Germany.
Exactly, a city within a city. The Soviets controlled the eastern part, the Western Allies, the West.
And Stalin decides to exploit this, right?
He does. He cuts off all land access to West Berlin.
Wait, he just blocked them in?
Essentially, it was a blockade, a siege in the middle of Europe.
Wow, that's a bold move.
It was a huge gamble. He was hoping to starve out the population, force the Western Allies to abandon the city.
And hand him a major victory in the process?
Exactly. But it was incredibly risky. He was essentially trying to strong-arm the West without starting a full-blown war.
Walking a tightrope, you might say.
Exactly. The stakes were incredibly high.
So what did the West do? Fold under pressure?
Not a chance. They responded with one of the most audacious, logistically impressive feats in history.
The Berlin Airlift.
The Berlin Airlift. For almost a year, American and British planes flew around the clock, delivering everything West Berlin needed to survive.
Food, fuel, medicine.
Everything. They were landing every 3 minutes at their peak. Imagine that.
It's mind-boggling, the sheer scale of it all.
It was an air bridge, keeping West Berlin alive. A lifeline.
And a powerful symbol of Western resolve.
Absolutely. Historian John Lewis Gaddis called it a symbolic victory for the West.
It showed that they weren't just paying lip service to this idea of containing communism.
They were willing to put in the effort, to take risks, to back up their words with action.
And eventually Stalin backed down.
He did. The blockade ended in 1949.
But I have to imagine things were never quite the same after that, right? I mean, after a standoff like that. Can you just go back to normal? I mean, after all that tension, I can't imagine everyone just went back to shaking hands and pretending things were normal.
Not quite. The Berlin Airlift, it definitely showed that the West was willing to stand up to Stalin, but it also made it crystal clear that Europe was now a divided continent.
Right, like the Iron Curtain had really descended.
Exactly. And just a few years after fighting side by side in World War II.
Former allies now on opposing sides.
It's a strange turn of events when you think about it. And this division, it became even more entrenched in 1949 with the formation of NATO.
The North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
Right. This military alliance between North American and European nations, it was basically a pact for collective defense against Soviet aggression.
So it's like they were drawing a line in the sand. If you mess with one of us, you mess with all of us.
Exactly. And of course, the Soviets eventually countered, with their own alliance, the Warsaw Pact.
Formalizing the divide. So a divided Europe, a world on edge, just a few years after the most destructive war in human history. It's a lot to process. So where does that leave us with this idea of containment? Was it successful?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And historians are still debating it to this day.
No easy answer.
Not when it comes to history. It's like looking at this giant, complex tapestry. Each historian, depending on their perspective, might focus on a different thread, a different pattern.
Okay, I see what you mean. So walk me through some of those different perspectives. What are some of the main schools of thought on containment?
Well, you've got the Orthodox historians. They're the ones who argue that containment was absolutely necessary, that Stalin was a ruthless dictator bent on expanding Soviet power.
And that the U.S. had a moral obligation to stop him.
Precisely. For them, the Cold War was a battle between freedom and tyranny. No room for compromise.
A very black and white view of the conflict.
In a way, yes. But then you have the revisionist historians, and they offer a different take. They argue that the U.S. was more motivated by self-interest than altruism.
Okay, so they're saying there was more to it than just stopping the spread of communism.
Right. They suggest that the real goal was to spread American capitalism, to secure markets and resources around the world. The Marshall Plan, for example.
Wasn't just about rebuilding Europe.
Exactly. It was also about extending American economic and political influence. Kind of like those Buy American campaigns, but on a global scale.
Interesting. So we've got two very different takes. One focused on ideology, the other on economics. What about those other perspectives you mentioned?
Right. Then you have the post-revisionists. They try to find a middle ground. They acknowledge that both the U.S. and the Soviet Union had legitimate security concerns.
Okay, so not just good guys and bad guys.
Exactly. The post-revisionists, they emphasize the role of fear, mistrust, and miscalculation on both sides. They argue that the Cold War was fueled by this toxic mix, this spiral of suspicion.
So a more nuanced view of what was going on?
Perhaps. And since the fall of the Soviet Union in '91, historians have gained access to a trove of previously classified documents from both sides.
Oh, wow. So they're getting the full picture now.
Getting closer. And that's led to a whole new wave of scholarship, which is giving us an even richer, more nuanced understanding of the Cold War.
Wow. It's amazing how much our understanding of history can change as we uncover new information. But I guess that's the beauty of it, right? It's an ongoing conversation, an ever-evolving story.
Absolutely. And what's important for us, listener name, is to understand that history isn't just about memorizing dates and names. It's about grappling with complex questions, considering different perspectives.
And recognizing that even events that happened decades ago continue to shape our world today.
Exactly. The legacy of containment is all around us. The alliances, the rivalries, even the way we think about global politics, it's all rooted in this pivotal period.
It really makes you think, doesn't it, about the choices we make, the consequences that ripple through time. This whole deep dive has been eye-opening.
I'm glad to hear that. It's a fascinating period full of twists and turns.
It really is. And listener name, I hope you found it as engaging as we did. We've thrown a lot of information at you today.
A lot to unpack.
But if there's one thing to take away from all of this, it's that history is rarely black and white. It's messy, it's complicated.
And it's full of these what-if moments that continue to fascinate us.
Exactly. So keep asking those questions, keep exploring, and keep diving into the depths of history with us. Until next time, listener name.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.